What's the impact of misinformation on your future leadership agenda? Perhaps it's more than just the responsibility of your finance and IT departments. 1 in 5 people got scammed last year in the UK, 9 million people. The annual cost worldwide of online fraud of consumers is put at somewhere around $10 billion, but it's hard to know exactly because many of us don't report because we're ashamed or time poor. But we're not just being fooled out of our money, we're also being robbed of our ability to think for ourselves. Upwards of 90% of people have fallen for fake news in the past year. The rising flood of mis- and disinformation affects our political beliefs, our relationships with our friends, neighbours and communities, our mental health and our sense of control. It's driving polarization that isn't just confined to online spaces, but is creating rising tensions and politics in our workplace. As more of what used to be personal becomes political, and then a matter of what affects us at work, leaders must continue to track the shifting agenda of these new responsibilities. In this show, we talk to one of the world's leading researchers on misinformation, how it spreads in online networks, and what behavioral interventions we can design to counter it at scale. Tune in for a crucial conversation on The Evolving Leader.
Hey folks, welcome to The Evolving Leader, a show born from the belief that we need deeper, more accountable, more expansive, more comprehensive. What else, John? What else do we need?
More eloquent.
More eloquent. Definitely more eloquent and more human leadership to confront the world's biggest challenges. I'm Scott Allender.
And I'm John Gomes.
How are you feeling today, Mr. Gomes?
I am feeling two things. I'm feeling glad that I'm at the back end of flu. I'm coming out of that. I'm feeling more like myself. And I'm also feeling a real urge to get some thinking from our guest today, because I think we all need this, given what's been happening in recent months and years. So I'm very excited to kind of be in this space to think differently about how I think. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling a mix of things. I'm feeling grateful for my toasty house right now as it snows outside and my kids are home for their second snow day in a matter of only being back from holidays for a week. But I'm also feeling a lot of sadness and sort of deep concern for many family members and friends and neighbors from my old stomping grounds in the Los Angeles area, and watching all of that unfold has been horrific. So bringing a mix of emotions with me today. And quite a bit of excitement as well, because we've been looking forward to this conversation for quite some time. Because today we're joined by Sander van der Linden. Sander is a professor of social psychology and society at the Department of Psychology at the University of Cambridge and director of the Cambridge Social Decision-Making Lab. Before coming to Cambridge, he held posts at Princeton and Yale University. His research interests center around the psychology of human judgment and decision-making. In particular, he is interested in the social influence and persuasion process and how people are influenced by misinformation and gain resistance to persuasion through psychological inoculation. He is also interested in the psychology of conspiracy theories, extremism, and radicalization. Not sure where he's seeing that in the world, but we'll be interested to talk to him about that. Media effects, social networks, polarization, and the emergence of social norms, reasoning about evidence, and public understanding of risk and uncertainty. He has published around 175 papers and is ranked among the top 1% of all social scientists worldwide. And we loved his multiple award-winning book, Foolproof: Why Misinformation Infects Our Minds and How to Build Immunity, which we're going to dive deep into today. Sander, welcome to The Evolving Leader.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Sander, welcome to the show. How are you feeling today?
I'm good. Also mix of feelings about everything that's going on in the world. From the wildfires. I have two colleagues whose houses burned down as well in LA. To being depressed about Meta shutting down its fact-checking program. To being warm inside while it's cold outside, and being back from holidays and ready to do some work again.
Hmm. Well, we're so excited to talk to you. I love the idea when I heard this that you're called the Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher at Cambridge. And
Right.
before we get into the depth of your work, I'm interested in knowing, when was the last time you were fooled by misinformation?
Um, well, it happens more than people would think. Just yesterday, I had a meeting with my students, and I'm organizing a conference, the Cambridge Disinformation Summit. This is not an advertisement for it, but one of my students said, oh yeah, the dates are April 12th to 16th when somebody asked us, and I was like, oh yeah, that's right. Um, and then I got home and I looked, and those were not the dates of the the conference. It's the last week of April. But for some reason, there was just kind of blind trust in an otherwise, uh, very smart student. So I used a cue of this person must be smart, hence, what they're saying makes sense, which most of the time is a good heuristic, but can fool us some of the time especially when people speak about things that may not be in their expertise. And of course, organizing my own conference is within my expertise, but I had forgotten the actual date, so I can't blame my student. I can only blame myself. But there you go. I was fooled
Mis-
by misinformation. Um,
Misinformation going around about the disinformation conference.
about the disinformation
Yeah.
conference, yeah. And I think this was misinformation because I mean it wasn't intentional. She wasn't trying to deceive anyone, right? It was
Of
just an
course.
error. So fairly innocent, innocuous misinformation, but just an illustration of how our brains are quick to jump to conclusions about things that kind of half
Mm.
match what we think is true about the world, and it happens on a frequent basis. And there's some people who think that we're all so smart and immune to everything, but from what I know, based on my research and my daily experience, I'm fooled all the time.
Your passion to understand and debunk fake news is tied to your sense of identity, I think. Can we start with how your childhood experiences in the 90s in the Netherlands shaped where you are today?
Yeah, so I grew up fairly we weren't overtly religious, but my parents were Jewish, and there's a sort of tradition of talking about what happened in the Holocaust. And when you're little, it's hard to wrap your head around this. Your family tells you, like, you ask, okay, where are we? Where's my cousins? Where are my nephews? Why don't we have more family members? And it's kind of strange when your parents tell you, well, most of them were executed during World War II. Um, and so, initially you just kind of accept that as an explanation. But, when I got older, I started thinking about, why do these things happen? How do people act on information that isn't consistent with facts or are based on conspiracy theories? How does that motivate people to do bad things? And so that didn't directly lead me to then investigate misinformation, but it sparked my interest in discovering the field of psychology, of why do people do what they do? How does the brain work? How does information impact us? And so that, I think was something that did get me interested in trying to understand human psychology. And then eventually I got back to the study of propaganda and persuasion in different contexts. But certainly, yeah, certainly there was a personal element to it, in that I was interested in how atrocities happen, and what role propaganda plays.
Hmm.
Tell us more about that journey of discovery. I'm curious to know, kind of, as you started to dive into the psychology of it, what was most surprising for you?
Um, Actually, what was surprising to me is that it's actually very hard to study. So there's a lot of sort of
Mm.
historical documentation about Nazi propaganda, how what went into it, how they designed it. Um, things like the big lie, which has a lot of relevance today, where it's really about the idea that if you create a lie that's so outrageous, it's actually more likely to work, because people wouldn't imagine that you would just come up with such an
Mm.
outrageous lie. Um, and that the more you repeat it, the more common it becomes for people. So you start out with an outrageous lie, which seems kind of crazy, but then over time, it becomes normalized. Um, and so what surprised me is that some of these propaganda tactics um, actually seem to be repeated throughout history and in different contexts. And I started thinking about the fact that, it wasn't just, World War II. I mean, they certainly did some of the groundwork in terms of figuring out what's effective. But what surprised me is actually the scale at which this is replicated across
Mm.
different types of conflicts and situations. And I started thinking, well, there's actually this playbook to propaganda that we should be uncovering. And the research around this is actually very difficult, both for ethical reasons. I mean, nobody's really done experimental research on Nazi propaganda. I mean, there's just no ethics committee at a university that would approve an experiment where you expose people to Nazi propaganda and see if they go out and attack Jews or
Mm. Hmm.
or LGBT members of LGBT communities, right? That just doesn't happen. So it's all a bit indirect in terms of trying to uncover the mechanisms by which it happens. So I became fascinated. I was kind of surprised by the fact that it's not something that you can easily study in a controlled and experimental setting. It takes a lot of interdisciplinary, historians and psychologists and simulated studies and economists actually doing very interesting work. There was a study, I think it was a great study, which I also cover in the book, which looked at birth cohorts, and it looked at people who were born um, before the Nazi regime, during and after. And of course, the Nazi years includes years of indoctrination in schools. There were pamphlets everywhere. It was a very extensive program. And they did find, and this is maybe to come back to Scott's point about what's so surprising, is that, of course, the expectation was that people who grew up during the Nazi regime would have more anti-Semitic views than people who didn't.
Mm.
But what was so surprising is that, even, you know, basically this was done, 2000, 2006, 2010, so not too long ago. We're talking, 10, 15 years ago. So even people who are currently living in Germany still have more anti-Semitic attitudes if they
Mm.
were, part of a birth cohort that grew up during the Nazi regime than people who didn't. And so they have these surveys, the National German Social Survey, and they ask, are Jews behind world events, and should Jews be allowed to, walk freely in German society, and things like that. And people who, both regions where people voted for Nazi parties and who are more exposed to propaganda, were still more anti-Semitic to this present day. And it was kind of surprising to me because I kind of thought it was all over, like, oh, this
Mm.
happened during World War II, and you would find an effect during that period, but not now or, 10 years ago. But that's what they found. And I think that's talks really about the longevity and the persistence of being exposed to propaganda. And I worry that, when we live in a time where we're just bombarded with lies and propaganda, and yeah, sometimes people say, oh, it's not so bad, or, it's not going to affect us. But I think what we know from propaganda is that, sure, yeah, people don't wake up one day and decide to start putting people in the gas chambers. That's not how it works. It's years of exposure to first
Hmm.
subtle and more implicit propaganda, and then you soften people up, you get them ready, and then it becomes more active, and then you start bombarding people with the more dangerous ideas, and throughout that whole process, it can actually leave an imprint on people many decades later. And yeah, that was surprising to me in terms of the outcome of that study. And of course, crucially, I should say that we're not empty vessels. We're not exposed to propaganda, and all of a sudden we become you get green lights and you become, green eyes, a little green light in your eyes, and you become a manipulated robot. I mean, that's not how it works.
Hmm.
Because areas that were already susceptible to this kind of rhetoric before the Nazi regime, that's why the propaganda was most successful, right? So you have to find people who are susceptible to your message in order for propaganda to work. Um, But it was surprising that it also worked in areas where people didn't have that prior susceptibility. Worked less well. Obviously, there was more resistance. But yeah, it's kind of worrying to think about it. That you don't even need that initial seat necessarily, but it certainly helps. And that was also the conclusion from Goebbels, who ran he was the minister of propaganda during the Nazi regime, who said that it works best amongst people who are already congenial to the message. Yeah.
So, I mean, we might live in a world where we think, the underlying assumptions that we've kind of evolved past kind of likelihood to be fooled by these kind of messages. What do you think is different today about how our brains have adapted to the online space?
Yeah, I think what's different today, and yeah, sure, some people say like, oh, but we've always had propaganda, right? We could go back further than World War II. We go back to medieval times where, people were stoning women and calling them witches because they had, ideas of independence and autonomy and they were mastering certain skills and crafts, and we label them witches and burn them at the stake. So that's been happening for a long time, and so people ask, okay, what's different now? But I do think technology has fundamentally shaped our relationship with information. I think that's what's different. But also the speed and velocity at which it travels. I think in the book I actually calculated how long it would take in the Roman Empire to spread a message by horse and wagon, and it would take a week. Even if you had the fastest cart, it might take a week to get your message out there, and then it would spread in a village. And so I kind of go through that diffusion process of, back in the olden days. And of course, now it all happens within the split of a second. You send a message on WhatsApp to a group of, 100 people who forward it to another group of 100 people. And before you know it, it's factorial, right? So before you know it, millions of people have been exposed within this, couple seconds. And same on social media. I mean, it's the networks are different, and so the structures are different in how information diffuses. But we can reach hundreds of millions of people, within seconds. And people are just we didn't necessarily evolve being bombarded by information all the time. That's also why we rely on rules of thumb, right? The brain is always trying to look for ways for shortcuts to try to manage information load. It's a difficult task for people to now log on and be exposed to so much information. And it's not just social media, right? It's cable news, it's podcast, it's radio, it's print, it's friends and family, it's social media sites, and more social media sites are popping up. And so we're trying to juggle all this information, and we know that if you stress the brain out, even on a simple task, if I give you a little memory task, you'll get less accurate at doing other tasks because cognitively our resources are divided. We only have so much, and we have to be biased in some ways, and biased in terms of screening out other things. And so I think the information overload makes that process worse in that we become more biased. We start being more selective, screening out more. And by selective, I mean, it's easier to process information, sorry, that you've heard that you've heard before, that feels familiar, that sounds familiar, that aligns with what you want to be true about the world. So all of those undesirable kind of biases that do have a function, but creep in and lead people astray. There's a relationship between the online and the offline worlds. Sometimes people think, well, it's okay, it's all just virtual conversations, but that's not true. As we've seen in the UK, what starts as a fake news story about, let's say, a tragedy. This was people who don't know, there was an assailant who stabbed a number of young girls right at that dance. I think it was it was a dance class, and there was fake news about who this person was. There was some fake story that it was a Muslim asylum seeker who came to the UK by boat. I mean, this was all total nonsense, but it was the catalyst for major offline riots that occurred. Buildings were put on fire. People got violent. And you see that elsewhere too. Take January 6th in the US, right? Capitol riots, false conspiracy theories that start online about stolen elections actually then can lead to violence. It doesn't always. There were this election. There were left-wing conspiracy theories about the election being
Mm.
fraudulent, and that didn't lead to violence in that case. But sometimes it does. There's a probability there. There's a concept called stochastic terrorism or stochastic violence, and so all of that online hostility, toxicity raises the probability of stochastic violence. And so, that's new. It's not something we've dealt with before. And then the last thing I'll say is, with the role of AI and deepfakes, micro targeting, right? Hitler didn't have targeted ads, right? Imagine if he had access to voters'
Mm.
digital footprints, and he could target them specifically based on their prior beliefs, because that's what they were looking for, right? People who were congenial to their message. What if they had such a fine-grained machinery that actually allows them to target a single person with their specific preferences? And so that's the environment that we find ourselves in now,
Hmm.
that there's the technology that can do that. And a couple of years ago, we people were right. There were Russian farms, troll farms, who were writing these messages by hand or on the computer, right? Oh, this person, is watching these YouTube videos, so let's craft a message that plays into, the type of content that they're watching. That's labor intensive. It's costly. Now you can have AI write hundred thousands of variations on the message within a split of a second, right? You can just automate it. Deep fakes, people are not used to that. People are very bad at it. Research shows, people struggle with differentiating synthetic from authentic content online. Luckily, we're not inundated by hyper realistic deepfakes yet, but the technology is there, and we know that people are bad at discerning. Regulations trying to catch up. So yeah, I would say there's a lot going on in the online information environment that makes our situation very different from what it was before. And the last thing I'll say is that there's been a big change, I think, in the news model too. So, when you go from the printing press, and the first, yellow journalism, the first tabloids, right, which were already a bit gray area content sometimes, with some hoax stories here and there that were duping people, to cable news, which also lowered the standard a bit of what you can say. Um, but at the end of the day, news, traditional news, legacy news, has producers, editors, fact checkers. There's guardrails. There's lots of layers. You can't just go, and there are regulators. In the UK, you have Ofcom, for example. In the US, you have, um, independent watchdogs. There are procedures. False advertising. There's laws around that. So there's a long history that, the evolution of TV took a long time, right? Before there was full penetration of television in the general population. There was a lot of time for legislation to evolve, try things out, test things out, see what's going on. With social media, it all happened within the course of just a few years, right? It exploded, and I think we're still trying to catch up. A whole different debate with Jonathan Haidt's book, and people going back and forth over whether social media is bad for our mental health or good. Is it dangerous for teenagers and teens, and so on? And those are difficult debates, and the evidence is difficult to comprehend, because there's so much exposure and so little research in terms of what we actually know, and trying to catch up to that is difficult. And I think that's partly what's going on with this debate as well. So what I would say is that on YouTube, you know, there's no guardrails, there's no editor, no fact checker, there's no producer. Anyone can just say what they want. There's no barrier to entry. So that influencer model of news, most people,
Mm.
not well, a lot of people are getting their news from influencers now online. More and more people are getting their news from social media. I mean, there's no verification process. And so that's a whole different model from the model that we're used to with news, where people expect that things have been fact checked. Of course, errors are made, but there's a process, there are committees, there's procedures, right? And we don't have that with the current online environment. There was a survey from UNESCO, the top influencers on Instagram, TikTok, and they asked them if they checked their content before they put it out, and they said no. I think 90% or something said no. We don't really view our role as being relevant. It doesn't have to be factual, and we're just trying to influence people with interesting content, right? And they don't see themselves as a purveyor of accurate news, and that's a whole different model.
So you've said so many important things in there. I want to pull some of it apart a little bit farther if we can, because you talked about susceptibility, and we're all susceptible, and there's surveillance capitalism and targeted marketing according to what you engage with, and that's a real problem. We've talked about that on the show. You also hit on the group of people who are most likely to gravitate towards information that aligns with what they want to be true about the world. And I see that a lot in the sort of coaching work that I do as well, that there are some people who are really more prone to that and some people who are less likely to that. They have a more inherent sense of doubting that's healthy, of like, I'm going to challenge that idea that I've seen, or I'm going to explore it. I'm going to look for other avenues. So you talk about this thing, wherever you fall on that spectrum, you talk about this idea of psychological vaccination against misinformation, that you can inoculate yourself. So can you start pulling that idea apart a bit further for us?
Yeah, and so that is based on this idea that there's variation in susceptibility. We're all susceptible, but some people are more susceptible than others. So some factors have to do with the brain or people's personal characteristics, but sometimes it has to do with the environment in which you find yourself, and that kind of determines susceptibility, right? Then there's how misinformation spreads on social media, and it turns out you can actually use models from epidemiology that we use to study viruses to study how information spreads, and they actually fit pretty well. I mean, they're simple models. People spreading information is slightly more complex than a virus replicating itself, but there's a really close analogy there, that those models actually do really well at predicting how viral rumors diffuse. And so we started wondering, well, if misinformation spreads like a virus, is it possible to then inoculate or vaccinate people against it? And this sort of research goes back to the 1960s, where people have been asking the question of whether it's possible to protect. And this was actually in the context. This psychologist McGuire was really interested in this idea because the U.S. government. This was at the time of the Korean War, and there were prisoners of war in Chinese prison camps at the time that voluntarily stayed behind after the war, and the U.S. government was concerned that they had been brainwashed, and that they were going to explore communism. And of course, reality turned out to be much more complex than that, but they didn't know, at the time what was going on. And so their whole impetus was like, okay, for the next generation of soldiers, we're going to give them more facts, and we're going to teach them about all the things, of why America is so great, and if they ever get, captured again, they won't be confused about, why America is right. And McGuire kind of said, I don't think that's the right approach. I think what's happening is that when they were captured and people were attacking their belief system, they had no mental defenses, and that is the problem. What you need to do is actually simulate an attack on soldiers, so to speak. Give them a sense of the types of threats that they might be facing in the future, then refute those in advance, so that you give them the ammunition to build up resistance over time. And that, I think, was a very powerful idea. I mean, he never tested it with soldiers or anything like that. In fact, when he tried to do a survey in his class, there was actually mixed support for capitalism and communism. So it wasn't about value judgments about these things, but he wanted to know the process. And so he did some studies that were interesting. But then, then he left that research for what it was. And so one day I became fascinated about this idea of whether anyone's already looked into that. And I came across, in the library, an article from the 60s where of course, McGuire didn't have the internet at the time. He didn't know about epidemiological models. But I actually thought, let's take that basic idea, that metaphor, and let's test that empirically in the 21st century, and that's kind of how it evolved and how we build out this theory of psychological inoculation, or pre-bunking instead of debunking. So how does it work? It just follows the vaccination analogy. So the idea is that instead of just giving people facts, you actually give people a weakened dose of the types of misinformation they might see in the future, or the techniques used to produce misinformation, and you deconstruct, neutralize, to pre-bunk them in advance, so that people become more immune to it in the future. So just as vaccines introduce a weakened pathogen into the body, that triggers the production of antibodies to help confer resistance against future infection. It turns out you can do the same with information and the brain. And the body's looking for right? Antibodies are made, and it's looking for potential invaders. And the brain does the same thing. Like when it comes to threatening information, the brain's looking for, what's threatening me. And so it benefits from seeing lots of microdose examples of what's manipulation, what's not manipulation, so it can help discriminate better between the two.
Can you give us an example of something that, listening right now, you could give us like an inoculation against some misinformation?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's a good point. It's because, it does sound a bit abstract. I'll make it very concrete. I'll choose a non-political example because, sometimes, people might, say, oh, but, who determines what information is correct and not correct? So let's sidestep that for a second. And let me give you an example that's more about the techniques that are used in disinformation. And one of those is the false dilemma technique, which is one of my favorites. Not to use, but to study, right? Which is the idea that you present people with two options. Well, in fact, there are many more, but the whole goal is that you try to take out all the nuance and you try to breed extremism. And so, for example, somebody might say, now in the context of the U.S., you might say that, if you're, if you don't support automatic rifles, you're against the Second Amendment or something like that, right? You can be a supporter of the right to bear arms, but maybe automatic rifles in schools is a little too much, right? So there's a lot of nuance there, but you portray it as a false dilemma. Or if you support this country, then you're against this country in a particular type of conflict. Actually, maybe you sympathize with both countries, right, and the goals that they're trying to achieve. So politicians love to use false dilemmas, and disinformation producers do that too. So what's an inoculation in this context? You have to find a weakened dose that is harmless, but generates the relative resistance that you need. So we produce these videos where we actually start using popular culture examples. So we expose people to a clip from Star Wars. Are you guys Star Wars fans? I'm not sure. So it's a little bit, yeah. Little bit. There's an episode called Revenge of the Sith, and so Obi-Wan Kenobi's talking to Anakin Skywalker, who, spoiler alert, becomes Darth Vader, right? And so,
oh man, you gave it away.
I gave it away. And so, he sort of says, either you're with me or you're my enemy. And then Obi-Wan goes, only a Sith deals in absolutes. And so then the narrator goes like, oh, don't use these manipulation techniques, don't join the dark side. And it's kind of a fun, non-political way of illustrating the false dilemma, right? Everyone gets that example. But then we test people, we bombard them with social media messages in real high-stakes context that use this technique. And we find that people become better at recognizing it because they've internalized the weakened dose and now have some immunity because it has a template. And the Star Wars thing is funny because it gives you the template of either you're for or against, and that's sort of the element people remember. And then when they're bombarded by, it doesn't matter what the content is, but it's the same structure, either you're for or against. And it sort of rings a bell and says, oh, yeah, that's a false choice. I shouldn't fall for that. Or at least now I'm empowered to make up my own mind. And that's the idea behind pre-bunking.
Why is disinformation so hard to get rid of? I mean, even when, we know it's untrue, why doesn't the virus leave us?
Yeah. So why doesn't the virus leave us? Yeah. Well, in that sense, it is tricky because once we're exposed to a falsehood, it integrates into our memory system. So our memory is kind of like a network, like a social network. So it has nodes or concepts like food, vaccines, right? And then there's links between the different nodes. So there's live vaccines, inactivated vaccines, cities, food, combinations of the two, right? It's this vast network of concepts and all the sorts of links between them. And when you expose people to misinformation, for example, let's say, John, that I had takeout, from the Indian place around the corner from where you live, and I had terrible food poisoning. It's terrible, and I go on and on about like I was, it's terrible. Don't go there. Then 2 weeks later, we were catching up, and I said, oh, by the way, it wasn't that place around your corner. It was a totally different place. I got confused. But now every time you pass that place, you're going to think food poisoning. And so the problem is that what you see in research, and this is what we call the continued influence of misinformation, is that people continue to retrieve false details from their memory, even when they've acknowledged a correction. In the formal sort of experiments that's done around this, you put people in, let's say, a brain scanner machine, and then you give them some story about how a warehouse burned down, and there was some report that said there was oil and gas cans in the closet that caused it. And then later, the police chief actually says, oh, the oil and gas, that wasn't the cause of the fire, or something else. But then you ask, people come out and you ask them to make, judgments, inferences about lots of questions. Why was there so much smoke? And then people say, oh, it's because of the oil in the gas cans. And so they completely, forget that they've just acknowledged the correction, that it wasn't the oil in the gas cans. And so it sneaks in, it makes friends with other things that and it becomes a game of whack-a-mole. So you can try to inactivate some of the nodes and links, and you can see that in the scanner, in the sense that there's some, there's what we call a retrieval account, which is that something goes wrong during the retrieval process of the correction. So people are accessing the myth in their brain, but they're not retrieving the correction for some reason. There's also an integration account, which is that people are not integrating the correction into their mental model of how the world works. So they have the myth, but they're not integrating the correction around it. And so it's a bit neuroscience-y, but I think that the bottom line is the same, though. It's that corrections tend to be long, scientific. They don't resonate with people. They come too late. So there's all sorts of reasons why people just forget about corrections and sort of focus on the myth. And in fact, when you have to debunk, you're always in a strategically disadvantageous position, because you have to repeat the misinformation in order to debunk it. So if you're not debunking effectively, what you're doing is you're repeating the misinformation. People forget the correction. So fact checking does work partially if you do it well and you don't repeat the misinformation too often. Some people like to call what we call the truth sandwich, which is basically you start with facts. You only repeat the necessary misinfo once, and then you layer on the facts again at the end to minimize any risk of repeating the misinfo. But even in the best case scenario, you're only partially doing undoing the damage. There's a famous saying from the legal context as well. When a jury hears something about a defendant they weren't supposed to during a trial, and the judge says, no, disregard that, you can't unring a bell. And that's kind of the point.
Yeah. Hence the importance of pre-bunking.
Exactly. Trying to prevent people from encoding misinformation in the first place is so much, in theory, so much more effective and desirable. And so that's why we try to spend so much time on doing that. Prevention is better than cure.
Is the scale of the current sort of propaganda machine and false choice and misinformation, is it as big as it feels to me at the moment? Sitting here in the U.S. and you mentioned at the beginning of the show the sadness you feel around Meta doing away with its fact checking. I'd love to sort of get your thoughts on the scale of the problem and kind of what's going on in your perspective with like Meta doing what they're doing, for example.
Yeah, I can answer that question. I think because you mentioned Meta, I think one thing that disappoints me is the politicization around this topic, right? And it's become the idea that fighting misinformation or misinformation itself, it becomes fused with party or identity in some way. That's a sad state of affairs. I mean, everyone should care about facts and truth, including businesses and leaders. And we all have other motives in life. People have social motives. They have reasons why they prefer not to tell the truth or endorse something that's not entirely true. And that's true for people as it is for businesses. There are other motives. But at the end of the day, we should all strive or do our best to rally around the truth. And Mark's statement that fact-checking is biased or it didn't work for him is a bit disappointing, because that's not what the research shows. I mean, there was just a paper out this week that looked at, in the U.S., members of Congress. They get fact-checked at equal rates. Democrats and Republicans get fact-checked at about equal rates. So it's not that Republicans are being singled out for fact-checking. On the Facebook platform, he wants to move to community notes, which is a sort of crowdsourcing fact checking, which I think is not a bad idea. I mean, this is a nice idea. There is wisdom in the crowd, so it's a kind of a statistical artifact that if you have large crowds of people that are diverse in nature, then you're pooling all of that knowledge, right? All that wisdom. Some people overestimate, some people underestimate, but on average, you're actually getting pretty close. But what's interesting is that when you look at the research, the ratings from regular bipartisan crowds almost perfectly converge with those of expert fact checkers. And so it's not the case that there's some elite biased fact checkers, telling people what's going on. They're giving the same rating as regular bipartisan crowds when they're in the mindset of what's accurate and what's not. And then you can say, oh, we can replace one with the other, but that's not necessarily true, because by itself, community notes is not enough. By itself, fact checking is not enough. We need all of it, not less of it, which is basically what he's doing. And that comes to your question about volume, because yes, the volume has increased dramatically. It's difficult to put specific numbers on it, because you would need to have access to the archives of social media since their inception. A lot of that data is private. So we don't know for sure. We can only see public snapshots. But I think researchers are in fair agreement that there's more misinformation now if we adopt a broad definition of not things that are 100% false, but if you also include things that are misleading. There's a lot of it. The volume is bigger. It's reaching people in more ways, right? It's your phone, Snapchat, TikTok, TV. There's many more channels through which it can reach people. What people disagree on is not so much the increase in volume, I think. For example, there's more conspiracy theories out there. They're easier to find than ever. But I think people argue about the persuasion element. So the relevant equation here is volume, or exposure times persuasion. And people argue about the persuasion parameter, like has that gone up? Or people become more susceptible over time? And that's not so clear. And so, I would say, the one side, there's more volume. Susceptibility, people argue over. I would say that, we find ourselves in more susceptible situations when we go online, where we're in echo chambers, when we're in filter bubbles, when there's a high level of toxicity of online conversations, when we're being trolled. So I think when we're being overloaded with misinformation. So I think that sort of persuasion factor does go up when we're put in situations where it becomes more difficult for us to control our own biases or defend ourselves from targeted attacks based on our digital footprints that we might not know about. So, my reading of that science is that it depends, but the persuasion can in fact be higher than it was before, depending on the group that we're talking about and the situation they find themselves in. And that's still large groups of people, large enough to, let's say, influence an election.
So when in Foolproof, you talk about, if you're going to gain immunity from this misinformation, you have to recognize that it comes in multiple strains. You kind of pull this metaphor and you make the distinction between fake news and the building blocks of the misinformation. Can we talk about that for a moment?
Yeah, so one of the challenges with fact checking is that, you can't check every single claim. And in fact, it's true. Most news isn't fact checked because there aren't just the resources to go at the level of the claim. So with pre-bunking, if you do this or inoculation at the level of a claim, you run into a, not dissimilar problem in that you can't pre-bunk every possible thing somebody might say in the future that's false. But what you can do is look at what are the predictors or the building blocks of disinformation more generally over time. What are the recurring themes and tactics that people have used? And again, whether it's a government or a tobacco industry or any type of entity, a lot of the techniques are, or Nazi Germany, right? So a lot of the techniques are the same. And then it actually becomes possible to predict what misinformation people might be exposed to and how to inoculate people against that. And some of these building blocks include things like conspiratorial language, emotional manipulation, polarization, creating us versus them mentalities, trolling, which is huge during elections, In fact, if you look at what Elon Musk is doing with the UK, it's a classic example of trolling, right? But if you don't know that, you're going to keep responding, you're going to feed into it, and you become duped by the technique. And so that's, I think that's kind of a famous example of trolling. But actually, trolling is very common in manipulation more generally. Then there's things like impersonation, faking expertise during a, let's say, pandemic, fake doctors peddling fake cures, but also there were cases where again, in public health, famous cases, and courts ruled on this in the U.S. that the tobacco industry used fake experts with the white coat to try to sell people cigarettes, right? That's also manipulation, and so that that technique is recycled across lots of different domains. And so what we do with the pre-bunking is we try to tune people to these techniques. To give you another one of my favorite examples is actually there's a lot of talk about how the vaccine, the COVID vaccine, is going to change people's DNA. All the conspiracies about about that stuff. New technology. mRNA vaccine. But actually, of course, people can have questions about new technology, right? That's totally fair. But if you go back to the 1800s, to the development of the first modern vaccine, which was Edward Jenner's cowpox vaccine against smallpox. If you look at the artwork for the 1800s, I do this in presentations. I show people paintings where basically cows and udders were sprouting out of people's heads and mouths. And the whole idea was that if you took the cowpox vaccine, you were going to turn into a human-cow hybrid. And so this idea that a vaccine is going to change your DNA, even when it didn't have the word DNA, is 200 years old. And it's just recycled over and over again. And that's the idea of inoculation pre-bunking, that there's these building blocks of disinformation. And, we lay out 6 in one of our interventions, and we give a kind of an acronym to help remind people. But it's always the same. With conspiracy theories, people say, okay, but this one's true. And so sure, sometimes a specific theory can have merit to it, but the psychology of conspiratorial thinking is fallacious in the sense that it's a predictable narrative. There is somebody plotting something behind the scenes. They're having evil intentions. There's some persecuted victim. In fact, in experiments, we give people these ingredients and we say, can you come up with the conspiracy? People come up with beautiful conspiracy theories, very elaborate, using those ingredients. And it's always the same ingredients. There's a celebrity is either dead somewhere, but also still alive. Avril Lavigne is a clone, right? Tupac Shakur is living it up on an island somewhere. It's always the same thing. And so when you train people on these things, even when people are kind of like, yeah, Watergate and so on, or, Epstein, it's kind of fishy. Sure, nothing wrong with keeping an open mind, right? But when you show people the ridiculousness of how it's always the same sort of, structure, people start thinking, hey, maybe I'm being duped by the fact that it's somehow always the same narrative, just in a different context, and people just never see it all together. So that's what we try to do, is put it together for people. And so those are the building blocks that I talk about in the book. And it's interesting because the fact checker's intuition is actually slightly different. It's that you have to go deep and contextual about a specific claim, and you can only figure out what's true or not by looking at a claim and investigating its truth sort of value. But I think we find that at the level of the building block, you can go much broader and you have much more predictive power. And sure, it's not going to be 100%, to make a joke about the book, foolproof, right? For every single instance. But on average, this is a pretty solid heuristic because we're using multiple cues. So in our inoculation games, we don't give people one cue. For example, emotionally manipulative language, which is a very popular one online for misinformation producers. But sometimes a true story could be emotional, right? Now, if a true story is highly emotionally manipulative, you can question whether it should actually get the status as true, or whether it should be, true but manipulative enough, which is kind of my preference. And so I don't really mind if people become a little bit more skeptical of content that is kind of, has some truth value, but is actually pretty manipulative. I think that's a good thing. But, if you want to be technical about, it should be that it has multiple cues. That's what we do in the game. We teach people about conspiracies and fear mongering and impersonating fake doctors. And there's at least 6. And so models show when you put all of these cues together, the probability of correctly identifying, future disinformation that you haven't seen before actually goes up pretty high. I mean, we're talking, not 100%, but we're talking, 80% or something, which, if you look at the research on human lie detection, if you get above 50%, that's a huge accomplishment. And so, I think it's probably the best we can hope for.
What is the kind of spread of motivation for spreading misinformation? Why did Donald Trump, for example, want people to think that injecting bleach against COVID was a sensible idea? What is because it's not just one motivation for doing this stuff. What is it?
Yeah, so there's been some work looking at what motivates influential elites to spread disinformation, and it's varied. So there are some top motives. Obviously, one perhaps unsurprising is political. All right, so people want to gain political currency by spreading misinformation. The second popular one is financial. People want to make money off of it. This is very popular in the wellness industry. There's a lot of grifting going on in wellness. And it includes, celebrities and Gwyneth Paltrow. I'm sure, wonderful person, but when she tells people about infrared saunas, and kombucha, shakes curing COVID, I mean, that's just dangerous, right? And so that's it's hard to infer people's intentions, right? That's the tricky part. And I'm not saying anything about Gwyneth in particular, but the wellness industry in general is often about a financial grift, whereas the Trump type stuff is more about politics and power and control and influence. And then sometimes it's a combination of politics and money, but perhaps unsurprisingly, those are the key motivations. Growing your audience. Often, what you find is the social media element, right? Is it 100% to blame on the person? Maybe on politicians who have responsibility and accountability and know what they're doing, probably. But for certain influencers, the journey, if you look at their journey, they don't start out doing a channel duping people, right? They start out maybe with a guitar channel, seeing that guitar hang above your behind you, Scott, right? So they're doing a bit of music, right? Yeah, and then they get a few clicks, a few likes, but then randomly they're just frustrated one day, and they start talking about, I don't know, alternative medicine. And then, whoa, they're getting a lot of engagement now, a lot of likes. Maybe I should, start talking more about alternative medicine, right? And then, like, ooh, I'm going viral. Maybe I should start talking about conspiracy theories. And then, before you know it, and I don't want to say that's been, Joe Rogan or Jordan Peterson's journey, but certainly you see people evolve from being somewhat reasonable people to selling all kinds of nonsense now because it's that's what the algorithm and the incentive structure is rewarding on social media, and that's what we call the sort of the perverse incentives of social media. And we've done research on that. What predicts virality, looking at millions of posts across platforms, and the more extreme, the more polarizing, the more dunking on the other side, that's what gets engagement, that's what gets clicks. So that's where I think sometimes, and I don't want to take responsibility off of people completely, but I think it's an interaction, right, between the motives of individuals and social media that sort of creates this model. The last thing I'll say, Jean, to answer your question, there is this distinction we make between belief speak and factual speak, and politicians increasingly like to use belief speak because it seems authentic to people. That whatever the facts doesn't matter, they're being genuine, authentic about their feelings and what they believe to be true about the world, and they have the audacity to come out and say it, and they find that people reward that more so than what the facts are, and so we're operating more on a belief, gut feeling based model than a fact based model, which is a bit worrying when it comes to politics.
So what are the leadership implications here? So as people lead teams, in a world of increasing polarization and shifts in beliefs and all that they have to manage, what are the tips and sort of ideas you have for leaders listening on some of these watchouts to sort of keep their cultures free from the sort of perils we've been talking about?
Yeah, so I would say, leaders are, in fact, in an incredibly important position because they can help determine what the values of the team are, what the goals of the teams are, and in any given situation, I say you want to make sure that that you're incentivizing truthfulness, trustworthiness, and accuracy, rather over things like deception, lying, manipulation. And everyone feels kind of intuitively that that's true. But in practice, it can be quite tricky. So of course, team leaders are in a position to inoculate or pre-bunk misinformation with their team members. But pre-bunking or inoculation isn't necessarily kind of a top-down tool that people need to enforce. I mean, it is something we created, for the people, by the people, for the people. So it's a thing. It's a thing you can share with others. And I think the most neighborly thing you can do is that when you know that there's misinformation out there, when you know that there's false information or techniques, help other people spot it in kind of a non-judgmental way. That's often what I try to do. You can incorporate it into a team activity and a team building activity. How do you spot misinformation, disinformation, manipulation? Do it in a non-political way at first. With maybe talking about the level of the technique rather than specific claims. But also some things are in the company's interest, right? There could be strategic disinformation about organizations as well. There are plenty of examples. Wayfair was caught in a major conspiracy that they were trafficking young children in their furniture, right? And they were just bombarded with the crazy satanic pedophile ring conspiracies. And how do you prepare organizations for that? I think one of the things that companies underestimate a lot at the moment is the strategic risk of disinformation about their products, about their, what they're doing, and how to actually, go out and preempt that rather than just be reactive. You need to have a proactive approach to it. Gave a talk for risk auditors who, you think are thinking about these things, but disinformation wasn't really something that they were factoring in. And so I think, yeah, when you're talking about teams, you want to prepare your team for misinformation, whether that's about the company or the organization that you're working with, or about things that are going on in the world more generally. I mean, let's take a topic that is debated. Diversity and inclusion is relevant to every firm, right? It's a prickly issue at the moment with companies everywhere. And team leaders are in a position to say, okay, but what are legitimate questions, concerns that we can ask, and what's just plain misleading or disinformation about what's going on in that space. And sometimes you might need an expert, right, or invite someone who is an expert to come give talks. In fact, sometimes you might want to do a sort of community note style. I think one of the problems that I see is that there's always in this topic that there's a sort of perception of bias, like, oh, the leader is going to tell me what to believe, or we're going to hear from this person or that person. But why not crowdsource it then? Use the wisdom of the crowd as a team, and see what the wisdom among the team is in terms of a particular position, and then compare it to what experts are saying. Could be a fun exercise, right? It could be done anonymously. I often do it with my students. I have them rate claims individually and then again as a whole group, and see who's more accurate, and then see what the experts are saying, to get people more in touch with when are your intuitions leading you astray. When's the group useful? How do we deal with false information, both in terms of bottom up approaches and top down approaches. So yeah, I think team leaders and leadership in general, it's all about setting the example, right? That you wanna convey factual information as a company. I mean, it's a huge risk. One of the things the auditor said, which during this conference, which I thought was interesting, is that if the company puts out information that turns out to be false, either about the company history, about its products, that's a huge cost to the company. It's a PR crisis. So actually having leaders think about, how can we incentivize and promote accurate information is going to be a key thing, especially in a space where knowledge is becoming contested, and how to phrase things and how to fact check things, and how to have internal teams that deal with veracity of information and claims, I think was probably going to be quite an important topic moving forward.
And aside from the book, is there anywhere else our listeners can get information on your approach that would help them?
Yeah, of course. So all of our interventions, their games and stuff, they're free. We have videos, we have games, we have educational material people can use. Inoculation.science is the website where we house it all. It's all freely available. Inoculation.science kind of comes with the book. If people wanna learn more, that's where they can find some of the resources.
Wonderful. What's next for you, Sander? What are you doing with your research focus right now?
Yeah, right now we're doing a project on deepfakes. This is a really tricky one because, in order to inoculate, you need to have these sort of stable strategies, right? Whereas deepfakes, the technology is changing so fast. And if there's nothing to go on, no audio, for example, how do you inoculate? And so that is a challenge. So what we're trying to do is expose people to more ridiculous versions of deepfakes and kind of build the sort of internal deception monitor for deepfakery, if you will, to see if we can actually come up with a pre-bunking technique that works. We're trying to actually use the influencer model for the purpose of pre-bunking. Maybe official organizations aren't always the most exciting institutions to hear from. Maybe it's an influencer, right, that can deliver the message best. Often you see this with things like vaccine hesitancy in religious communities. Sometimes a religious leader is actually the best person to talk to people about, public health and not the CDC or the NHS. And so we want to do the same with inoculation. Maybe people don't want to hear from defense dark arts, Vander Linden. And so, maybe people want to hear from Taylor Swift. I don't know. And so, Taylor, if you're listening, we're open to I actually,
she's on every week. So
she's on every week. Yeah. So yeah. So who's the best? Who's the best communicator in this sense? That's a big open question. Yeah. The other thing is coming back to the volume question. Actually, it's very difficult to measure with limited access. So we're trying to figure out, how can we measure and track the volume of disinformation that's out there in a very technical way, how to operationalize that, as well as, how can we leverage AI to do good things? Can we automate pre-bunking? Can we automate fact-checking? Yeah, so those are some of the things that are at the top of my mind at the moment.
Well, Sander, I could talk to you about this all day. I wish we had more time, honestly. This is so important. It's so timely, it's so relevant, and so useful. So thank you for sharing a bit of your wisdom and research with us. And folks, if you haven't already gotten your copy of Foolproof, please do yourself a favor and order that today. Thank you again. So appreciate it. And until next time, folks, remember, the world is evolving. Are you?